Well, this is the third and the last video in the backup restore system for DVD base. And as you can see, we've added one more button, restore DVD base, and also a list box that has a label that says restore from. And that list box has all the backup files that we've created. And I showed in the previous video how we create backup files. And restore is essentially identical process, but using standard input rather than standard output. So the same classes pretty much are used. We're using stream reader instead of stream writer, and it turns out video 81 is an excellent video describing both stream reader and stream writer. And then process, which is described in detail in video 120. Process start info, which is described in 121. And standard input redirection, which we described in the first video of this series, 221. And the methods we use from StreamReader are read to end, which essentially reads everything in a file into a string variable, and close. And the process methods once again are start, which starts a separate process running in parallel with the current DVD base process, and standard input read to end rather than standard output read to end, and wait for exit, which allows you to synchronize the two processes. It essentially makes the generated process synchronous rather than asynchronous, because when we have a wait for exit, it's going to wait until the process finishes, just as though we called a synchronous function. And then close. And the process start info properties are file name, which contains the name of the exe we want to run in the process. And in this case, it's MySQL. Previously, it was MySQL dump, to dump the standard output out to the backup file. And now it's MySQL, which is the main MySQL command line interpreter. And we want to redirect the batch file into the command interpreter. So in effect, the standard input is the equivalent of keyboard type in, and the standard output is the equivalent of what's displayed on the screen. So basically, we're taking the batch file and sending it to the MySQL interpreter and saying, this is as though we're typing this whole long thing in, but we're really just redirecting it from a file. So in this case, redirect standard input is going to be true because we're getting standard input in, and redirect standard output is going to be false because we're not using standard output this time. And then the arguments, which is the arguments to the command line, and the use shell execute, which is set to false, which basically says just execute exe and don't bring in all the capabilities of the entire shell. So the file name part is the equivalent to the MySQL that we have in the command prompt or the DOS box, and the arguments part is the equivalent of all these: the -u username, -p password, and the database name. And we also have a third parameter, which is the -h host name, and the -h host name is localhost. And then the redirection is the equivalent of this operator. In this case, it says redirect the standard input, which is the same thing that happens when we set redirect standard input to true in the process info we pass to the process start. And finally, we have the file that gets read in via the stream reader and then passed to standard input. So if we look at the actual code for this, basically we check the selected index in the list box that has the backup files, and if it's equal to -1, it means nothing's been selected. So we just pop up a message box that says you have to select a backup script to restore from the list box below. And then if we have selected a file, we take the backup directory, which is defined as a string constant, plus the selected item, and we use that as the input to the stream reader here. And then we use the read to end to put the entire file in a string variable, which I call stdin, which is the old Unix name for standard input. And then we just close the stream reader file. And then we create a process start info structure. We set the file name to MySQL. We set redirect standard input to true, redirect standard output to false, and then once again we use our string constants for user, password, server, and database in a string format to set up the arguments exactly the way they'd be on a command prompt line, and finally set the use shell execute to false. And then we create a process I call restore process via the process start, which passes the process start info as an argument. And we use the restore process standard input dot write line with the string that we've filled in to write the entire batch file into the standard input of this process. And then we close the standard input with a standard input dot close, and we do a wait for exit in order to make this a synchronous process, because we don't want this process to do anything else until our restore process finishes entirely. And the restore process actually takes significantly longer than the backup process, so this becomes even more important. And then we do a restore process dot close and pop up a message box that says the DVD base was restored from the file and our restore file name. And I showed you these string constants before, but in case you didn't watch the other videos, this is the base backup file name, DVD base, and we concatenate that with a date and a letter in order to create the backup name. And then the backup directory, which we concatenate in our restore program, and the extension user is user, password is password, server is localhost, and backup database is DVD base. And I actually do something kind of interesting in order to fill in this list box. When you click on the utility tab, actually the default event unfortunately is click, so it won't do anything until you actually click on the page, so we didn't want that event. But if we go over to the event listing and go down to enter, I created a TP utility enter event handler. If we double click on that, I basically just call a routine called pop restore list box to populate that list box. And the reason I have it as a routine is I call it from two places now. I call it both from when we click on the tab of the utility and when we do a backup, because when we create a backup file we want to refresh this list. So by good coding practices, once you call it from two places, you definitely need a separate handmaiden function. And this basically just goes through and gets a directory get files of the backup directory we looked at the top of the file. And then it clears the list box, because if we're going to do this multiple times, we don't want to be adding to the end of the list box. And we do a for each that goes through each of the files that we got from this directory. And unfortunately these files are fully qualified, so it's c:/mysql/ etc. etc. So I do a path.getFilename, which just gets the base file name and puts that into the list box. Of course, when we actually execute it, we need to reconcatenate the backup directory in order to get to the actual data file for the script. But the irony of this is the first time you run the system, this box is totally empty, but you never know it, because when you click on this tab, it immediately becomes filled in before you actually see the page. So it's sort of like the light in an icebox. You're never really sure that it goes off because it always goes off after you close the door. This is the same way. It's empty until you click on the tab, but you never know because you have to click on the tab in order to see it. Well, if we compile, well, what we ought to do is go into MySQL PHP Admin and select the DVD-based database. And you see we have 3 tables. The first one has 678 records. The second one, genre, has 98 records. And the third one, location, has 12 records. And in an act of pure courage here, I'm going to drop this table first in order to avoid constraints. And then drop this table. And finally drop the location table. So now we have 0 tables within our database. And fingers crossed, we're now going to run the restore utility. So if I compile and run this, oops, I haven't started the WAMP server, so I'm going to have to do that. That's a pretty common error with me, actually. Double click on the WAMP server and say yes, run it, and then it goes from red to yellow to green, but did that so fast we didn't see it. And then I start running this again. Oh, it's getting an error because those tables don't exist. That's pretty funny. But if I go to utility and say backup from this database and do restore, or select that database backup script and do a restore, see it says restored from file, blah blah blah. Say OK, and then I'll close this and try running this again, and this time I don't get an error because those exist. We can go to the listing and click list all DVDs, and we can see the tables are there again. And in fact, if we go back into PHP MyAdmin, we see all the tables are there, and it's 678 for the DVDs table, 98 for the genre, and 12 for the location. So thank God everything got restored okay, since that was a heck of a lot of work. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot, and I'd appreciate it if you subscribe.